Hey gang, welcome to another volume of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. Thanks for listening. Before we get started, I wanted to remind you all about my Patreon account, and if you feel so inclined to throw me $1 or $2 for each video I produce, that would be awesome, and you can do as little as $1 per production, or just a one-time donation too. Patrons get access to content not available to anyone else, and at higher levels, merchandise like t-shirts and that sort of thing. So please consider it. Find the link in the description below, and another at the end of the video. Enjoy ad-free content here at Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. So without further ado, let's begin. The Ex-Husband. About 5 years ago, I spent 2 years as an apprentice to a psychic. Other than that, I'm a really normal person. As a matter of fact, I work in medical research. It seemed like that whenever we would have a lecture in mediumship class on a particular topic, I would already have great insight into the issue being presented to me through no effort on my part. It was like having a laboratory to the lecture in my head, in metaphysics. One time we had a lecture on ghosts, and what to do about them. I remember being disinterested in class, thinking, I'm never going to have a practical use for this stuff. I just figured nobody got haunted anymore, and I came to find out how wrong I was that very weekend. That Friday I had taken off from work as a vacation day, intending actually to just hang out and do nothing. An older friend of mine dropped by and off the cuff asked me out to dinner. During dinner he mentioned that he would like to visit his daughter and her family, who lived in an older section of Detroit. He mentioned that his daughter had since remarried, but that she had had a bad time the last 2 years. Apparently her first husband, David, had become increasingly mentally unstable, and the usual scenario of threats, physical abuse, and kidnapping the kids, the whole 9 yards came out. This is pretty typical in bad breakups. Sounded like a real fun guy. She managed to finally divorce him, but, as you can guess, this only escalated the situation. His enduring fixation was his son, who was just now turning 3 years old. Attempts to kidnap him or threaten to kill the child and himself were things they had to deal with every day. Police were involved, and injunctions proved useless. Finally, David was diagnosed schizophrenic and hospitalized a number of times. There wasn't anything that had much effect on him, though. The whole thing finally culminated in his breaking into their house one day while they were not there, and he was thinking they were going to be. Once he got there and found out they weren't home, he put a .44 Magnum in his mouth and pulled the trigger. That was the end of David. Or so we thought. When we arrived at my friend's daughter's place, the house was in an uproar. The house itself was one of those huge places they used to build in the suburbs of big cities, and one of those ones that was so big it had been split into a duplex. Nothing particularly creepy, just lots of wood, cabinet space, a couple of floors, and an attic. It was probably built in the 1920s. The next-door neighbor had just left that morning. The neighbor next door had left that morning in her nightclothes, and she'd left behind all her belongings, absolutely refused to go back. She said she had seen a blond, longish-haired man at the top of the stairs. The main problem, however, is that he had a hole in his head. A big hole. With his eyes all sunken back and what looked like blood all over him, she was terrified and ran out of the house. Apparently, this hadn't been the only occurrence, only the last in a long list of incidences. My friend's grandson claimed to have seen his father a number of times, always at night, standing next to his bed. The things had been broken when no one was home, as if thrown, and worse still, small fires had broken out under mysterious circumstances. In one instance, a portrait had been torn off the wall and thrown across the room, shattering the glass and leaving holes in the wall. Obviously, her ex had been incredibly jealous. The family was in a panic. They didn't know what was going on. They were planning to move, but couldn't do it right away. And I tell you what, I would have been out of there so fast I would have broken records. My friend's daughter had talked to a Catholic priest, and he had just laughed when she told her what was going on, and when she said that she needed an exorcist or someone to come bless her house, he just hung up on her. Suspecting what was going on, the daughter had taken a picture of David to the neighbor, who was staying at a hotel. The woman went into hysterics and told her to get away from her. It was the same man, of course, just without the ventilation job he'd done on his head. She asked me if somehow I knew of anyone who could remove this whatever it was. For Pete's sake, I thought, somebody up there really has a sense of humor. Well, yes, I told her, fully intending to recommend her to my teacher. I really had no intention of getting involved with this. I mean, I was just a student, and this wasn't my specialty anyway. It sounded to me like this David guy was dead serious. Sorry, terrible pun, but I got the feeling he was far more powerful than anything I wanted to mess with. My teacher had impressed this on us. Before you do anything, you had better know what you're doing and be completely confident in your ability. I was not convinced that I was either one. I was about to give her my teacher's card when she told me that there had been further complications. Her little boy had come to her after a nap that afternoon in hysterics. He was bleeding from the mouth. His gums were all red. He gave a young kid's garbled story about his father wanting him to go with him, and he refused to go back into his room for any reason. Honestly, he was the one that showed the most sense I'd seen in the family yet. But that did it. I reasoned that if this asshole David had this much balls, then there was no accounting for what he might do between now and the time my teacher could get out there. So I felt like I was beholden to do something now. I'm shaking just remembering this story, so bear with me. One of my strongest abilities lies in feeling the presence of spiritual entities. It's kind of like passing a magnet through iron filings. I just kind of get oriented towards them. So I know I would be able to locate him. The big question, would I be able to remove him? The power to do these things exists in the mind. And this can be as powerful or as weak as you tell it to be. Building up the energy and keeping it pumped up can be difficult. And honestly, I had never applied it to this kind of problem before. However, the thought of that little boy being harmed forced me to try. The trick is this. Essentially, what you do is try to make it as uncomfortable for the entity to continue staying there, and then persuade it to go on elsewhere. At this point, it has to make its own choice as to whether it should go across or whether it wants to stay. Other times, they are so bound to unfinished business that they stay to finish it, like this guy was. The fact that this guy was severely mentally disturbed when he died didn't help my confidence level any. The first thing we did was have a prayer vigil in the kitchen, while I went around and mentally covered everything with an ultraviolet light. This is God's color, and He is light, so nothing can penetrate such a shield. I covered everything. The house, family, the pets, appliances, their cars, all of it. We then went down to the basement, which was open to both apartments, and blessed all the doors and windows, all of them with olive oil in Jesus' name. Look, whether you believe in him or not, Jesus was one extremely spiritually powerful person, and negative entities don't like him, and they know they cannot withstand him. So we went through the entire house, both sides, laboriously blessing every door, window, and mirror in the house, and all the while I was building up the energy to make the place as light-filled as possible. The place seemed cool to me in the basement, even though it was kind of old and creepy. And I don't mean cool as in the sense of cold, it just seemed kind of neat down there. But as we went farther and farther upstairs, I started feeling more and more aware of the energy being pulled into the attic. I knew where he was, and he definitely knew where I was, and that I was coming up there to talk to him. I was fervently hoping he'd split before I got there, but again, the thought of that little boy really forced me to stay with it. How could you tell this without sounding crazy, right? I'd come to the conclusion that I had come there that day for a reason, and to just go with it. The sense of presence was strongest, of course, in the little boy's room, which had a trapdoor in the ceiling up to the attic. The whole front of my body was tingling, particularly my face and nose. I could sense the misery, hatred, and insanity from just above me. How I managed to get that trapdoor open and get up there, I have no idea. I was running on adrenaline, but at the same time I wasn't frightened. I had gathered my guides and angels around so tightly I think I nearly glowed in the dark. At this point, I am not kidding when I say I think I really was in an altered state. Something fell or flew from somewhere behind me and landed at my feet. It was a headless, naked child's doll. I remember thinking coolly, well, how cliché is this? But at another level, I was wondering, how the hell did I get myself into this? In the corner was absolute blackness, and that was what I was looking for. Now, David, you know that you really have no place here. You're dead, and your family needs to go on with their lives, particularly your little boy. Let go, David. I know you're miserable. Let go and go to the light. There is peace there. Wouldn't you like that? My guides and angels are here to take you there, so go with them. This house is completely protected now, and I'm sure it's very uncomfortable for you, but if you don't go, you'll know who I'll invoke. So please go with them now. Ultimately, my feeling for this poor lost soul was one of pity. I cannot express to you the level of misery and pain it existed in. Suddenly, I got a sense of release of tension, almost like a wind blowing, and the room became somehow less menacing, less dark. I stayed there for a minute longer, just until I was sure I wouldn't fall down the ladder trying to get down. My analytical mind kicked in, and responded by wanting to pass out. When I came back down, I just told the family that he was gone, but they would have to believe that he was gone and reinforce that daily, or all my light work would disintegrate, and he would come back. That's the thing about this kind of work. If they don't go to the light, and you don't reinforce your shields, they can come back. They've had no more problems in that house for quite some time, although I heard from a friend later that David did come back, so I guess he still has not found peace. The neighbor never set foot in her house again. She actually had family members remove all her property. Sometimes I wonder if it actually happened. I question what happened in that attic. Uncomfortably, the answer is always the same. Yeah, that did happen. My journal. One evening, like every other night, I was getting into bed to drift into sleep. I was writing a little bit in my new journal when I realized that I was the only one awake in my house. My two younger brothers were there, but my parents were in another city for a conference. Now, I never liked to be the only one awake because that meant I had to turn off all the lights in the house. And I hated doing that for 3 reasons: the darkness, the silence, and my apprehension that something was out there. I was slowly going downstairs when all of a sudden my hair was yanked from behind. I let out a quick yell and almost fell down, but luckily I caught the handrail. I was so scared that I ran all the way downstairs into the light, gasping for breath. I looked around me and saw nothing. After I calmed down a bit, I quickly turned off the lights and sprinted upstairs as fast as I could and went right into my brother's room. I flicked the light on to see if they were okay and found them both fast asleep. So, I went back to my room, very confused and a little bit scared. I sat down on my bed and tried to get some sleep, but my mind kept wandering off and thought about every possible answer to what had just happened. Eventually, I did fall asleep, with the light on. Later on, I woke up for no reason. The first thing I noticed was that the light was off, and I knew I'd left it on. There was some light coming in from my window, as my eyes became adjusted to the darkness. I was facing a blank wall, which is about a foot from my face, and everything was in complete silence. I became anxious because I'm used to the outside sounds that comfort me, because it makes me feel like somebody's out there. My house is right next to a road, and usually I'll hear a car passing every now and then, but now there was nothing passing at all to make any sound. It was so quiet that I could loudly hear my own breathing and slow heartbeat. I was starting to calm down again when I heard very heavy footsteps outside my window. I listened more closely, and suddenly they sounded like they were in the hallway. The footsteps sounded like something hard and sticky being pulled from a hard tile floor. In that moment, I was paralyzed with fear. I heard it walk very fast down the hallway and into my room, and it came straight towards my bed. When it got right next to my bed, it stopped. I had my eyes shut tightly, and tears were slowly coming from my eyes because I was terrified of what I might see if I turned over. I didn't hear anything for a while, but then suddenly, I heard my journal being opened. I knew it was my journal because it made the sound of the new plastic spine being stretched when being opened. Whatever it was flipping through the pages periodically, as if it was reading. Then it started flipping the pages really like it was looking for something. And then it stopped, I was thinking, hey, maybe it's one of my brothers trying to read my journal. So I stopped breathing in order to hear if someone else was in the room breathing. There was nothing, and the only sound I heard was my heart pounding. Then I started to hear pages slowly being torn from the book, and I let out a small whimper of surprise. The tearing suddenly stopped. I grasped my covers as I heard the footsteps coming closer to me. Adrenaline hit me hard and fast. I quickly jumped out of bed and ran toward my light as I saw my journal thrown out in the hallway, barely missing my head. I switched on the light and yelled for my brothers, and they both came dashing toward me with tears flooding their faces. I choked out, "Are you guys okay?" And all they kept crying was, "We saw it! We saw it!" The rest of that night, we all slept downstairs and waited for our parents to come home the next morning. My brothers told me that they had seen a tall, skinny, humanoid figure that was bright white walk upstairs, into my parents' room, and then into mine. They said it had looked into their room, but it didn't come in. Both of them said it looked like a child's face with no eyes, just round holes. But it had a huge, wide smile. I didn't even want to picture that. We told our parents, and they told us that there was nothing in the house. I'll tell you what, I never wanted to go in my room again after that, but I eventually did when my parents came back. My journal was torn to shreds out in the hallway, and all of my other books had been knocked off the shelf as well. Now I'm more curious than scared about why it came looking into my room and reading my books, or why it wanted to cause me harm. It never came back. And either way, I never want something like that to happen ever again. I have a real-life and internet stalker. First off, I would like to say that I am a 16-year-old female, and I live in a small town in New York. These events have been going on for about 2 years now, and I'll be using the name Ariel as my name to protect my identity. I have been active on the internet since I was about 8 or 9 years old. When I was 14, I decided to join this group chat on a website. I don't recall what it was called, but it was a website where you could exchange each other's Kik, Skype, phone numbers, and stuff of that sort. Being the ignorant kid I was, I put my information on that website. I used Kik and Skype, and for some reason I didn't give out my phone number. I only got a few people who actually replied and texted me on Kik and Skype, but no one really stood out to me except one person. There was this one older guy that started texting me. He claimed he was 16 years old, and he said his name was Alexander. We were mainly interested in the same things: video games, the outdoors, anime, that sort of stuff. Everything was fine. Or so I thought. We would text every day, and we would talk about innocent things, like how our day was and what we had planned for the weekend. Nothing too out of the ordinary. We would usually go from Kik to Skype pretty frequently, and I would turn on my camera, but he never turned his on. And that was one sign I didn't pay attention to. After talking for like 3 months, things started escalating. And what I mean by that is he started telling me to do sexual things on my camera so he could see. When I would say no, he would say he knew where I lived. I had some common sense and ended the call right there and then. I was frightened because he had never acted that way towards me before. He ended up calling my Skype about 20 times, and I had to shut down my computer because I just couldn't take it anymore. I know what most of you are wondering. Where were my parents? Why weren't they parenting me to not talk to strangers and stuff like that? Well, let's just say my parents are very careless. And not in the way like they don't care about me or don't love me, because they do love me a lot. It's just that they trusted me enough to let me have a phone and a computer. Alexander started calling about 5 times every day, and if I didn't pick up, he would start texting my Kik. I didn't ever think to block him, because I did block him once before, but he just kept creating a new Kik account and then a new Kik account each time I would do it. I also had a Facebook account. Yeah, a 14-year-old with a Facebook account. Smart, right? Alexander ended up finding it, and he would post things like, "I know where you live," and "I see you have your mom on Facebook." I ended up uninstalling Skype, Kik, and I ended up deactivating my Facebook too. I went on with my life, but something happened a year later. I got a text on my phone from an unknown number that read,
"Hi, sexy. Remember me? You looked amazing today in your tight dress with your black socks and hat.
I replied with, "Who's this?" I thought it was one of my guy friends who was playing a prank on me to just mess around. I texted every one of my guy friends from my contact list asking if they were the ones behind it, and they all replied no. And that's when everything hit the fan. I started to receive all these texts when I got home from school. And that one day I was wearing a tight dress, and a hat, and black socks. The number finally replied,
"Honey, it's Alexander. Don't you remember? How could you forget? I finally get to have you all to myself."
I looked at that text and almost threw up. I was beyond terrified. I locked all the doors to my house, and I was going to be home for a while until around 6 p.m., so I never texted the number back, but it kept texting me. I ended up blocking the number and falling asleep. About a week later, I was walking home from school on a hot day. You ever get that feeling where you feel like you're being followed or watched? That's the feeling I got. And of course, I was walking alone. I slowly turned my head around, and I tried to make it look like I was looking for a house number, and I noticed a black car following behind me. I held onto my cell phone tightly and was planning to make a break for it as soon as I hit a certain street. The street was about 2 blocks away from my house. And let's call the street Shady Way. When I hit Shady Way, I booked it. I ran behind the house that was behind my house, and then I ran through the back door, slamming it shut behind me. I realized I was crying. I locked every door and ran to my bedroom upstairs. I felt so sick. And that's when I felt my phone buzz. The next text disturbed me and will haunt me for the rest of my life. It read,
"I know where you live. Even inside, you can't hide from me."
I called 911, and I explained that a guy who claimed to be 16 when I was talking to him online was actually an old man, and he found out where I had lived. The operator said a police officer was 5 minutes away, and it felt like forever before he got there. I heard a hard knock at the door and ran downstairs. I opened it, and it was the officer. The officer explained that they saw a suspicious black car drive by, but couldn't get the license plate number because it took off. Officers around here are practically useless. I ended up telling my mom and dad what happened, and they just said we would file a report and have some hope that he would get caught. But what could we charge him with? He never really did lay a hand on me. Every day I walked from my home to school, and I practically lived in a constant state of anxiety. Even writing this now gives me anxiety. I could never have a friend or a parent drive me, and I was too young to drive, so walking was the only way. My grades were starting to slip at school, and I didn't stay awake in classes. My life was falling apart. I never slept at night, so I slept when I was at school. I did have some friends to help me through the time, though. I had one friend who we will call Violet understood me very well. Violet was a sweet and understanding girl. She was only 1 year older than me. I invited her over one weekend when my parents would be out of town. We stayed up late into the morning hours and gossiped about guys and everything else girls usually talk about at sleepovers. But then it happened. My phone went off. I grabbed it and gasped as I read what was on the screen.
"Hi, Ariel. How are you? I see you're home with your friend Violet."
I had had enough of this at this point, so I replied as Violet begged me to not do it and feed into what he wanted. "Oh, you're watching me? Ha, okay. Where am I right now? What am I wearing?" He quickly replied, "You're in your bedroom."
"You're wearing a shirt with a skull on it, and you're wearing shorts. Your friend is wearing a white t-shirt and shorts, too."
I paused, thinking of what to say next. I was very scared. I ended up calling my mom and dad to come home early, and explaining what had happened. I was scared, and so was Violet. My family couldn't do anything. He didn't do anything to hurt any one of us. A few months later, we ended up moving for financial reasons, and we moved to another small town in New York. I forgot about Alexander for a while, and it was peaceful. I didn't worry about having to watch my back every second. But about a week ago, I received another message. from an unknown number. The Pontianuk. This is not my story, but the story of my friend's father who grew up in Indonesia. One night, her dad and some of his good friends went out for some drinks after work till late in the evening. On the way home, he was the one that was driving everybody else back to their places. He had decided to take a shortcut as it was getting kind of late and everybody wanted to get home. This road was not properly lit up, as not too many people actually traveled it at night, and it was rather deserted. While rolling down the road, all of them were chatting happily in the car. But before long, my friend's dad saw a lady in white standing in front of the car, and he asked all of his friends to see if he was making it up or if they saw it too. The lady in white was standing along the road and trying to flag down the car, maybe a few meters away from them. My friend's dad was reluctant to stop as he had heard that this road might have been haunted, and at this hour it was weird that a lady dressed in white would be standing alone in the dark. He told his friends that he wasn't going to stop the car, and actually sped up a little. As though the lady in white knew their intention of not stopping, she walked into the middle of the road to block off their car. And not being able to stop in time, the car hit the lady in white but went straight through her. My friend's dad immediately stopped the car, and the air grew tense. Inside the car, they talked about who was going to get out and see what had happened and what was happening to that lady. Is she still out there? After a few minutes of talking, they decided everyone should get out and check it out. Once they left the car, they searched everywhere for the lady in white, but she had vanished. There was no one there. They quit looking after a bit, and then headed back to the car. My friend's dad started the car and began traveling home again. None of them spoke much as they were all thinking about the lady in white. Had they made it up? Was it a group hallucination? After going about 100 meters, my friend's dad looked into the rearview mirror and he screamed, "Look! Behind us! She's chasing us!" They all looked, and to their horror, the lady in white was indeed flying as fast as she could chase their car. My friend's dad immediately hit the gas, but she kept getting closer, and what they saw scared the daylights out of them. The lady in white had fangs, and her dress had blood all over it. I guess some of the guys started screaming, and some of the other guys were praying for safety. After about 15 minutes of chase, my friend's dad saw a holy temple, and he headed straight for it. When they reached the compound of the temple, the lady in white was nowhere to be seen. They felt foolish, but they decided to stay there and wait until morning to head out again. Once the sun came up, they rushed into the temple to pray, and then they headed straight home. Here's where it gets weird. The next day, 2 of the guys came down with high fevers that lasted for over a week. One had an accident and was hospitalized, and the other 2 had nightmares for almost a month. They truly believed that what they saw was a Pontianak, a female vampire-type entity that was once human, but died in childbirth. Folklore says they seduce men or helpless people to kill them for their blood. I can't say for sure that any of that is true, but my friend's dad is a burly guy, and he's no chicken, and he stands by his story, and while I wasn't there, I'm inclined to believe him. Prank gone wrong. I was a teenager living with my mom and sister in a small town in Washington state. My mom had been divorced for some time and decided to start dating again. Her very first date, someone who she had met through a friend, went horribly wrong. He was drunk meeting up with her, and she decided to leave early. Later that night, we awoke to a phone call at 3 a.m. We let it ring, and it went to voicemail. It was the same guy, calling to make threats to my mother and us, calling her a bitch and other foul names. We saved the message and gave it to the police, and we never heard anything from him after that. The following weekend, I went to a house party while my mom and sister were out of state for a volleyball tournament. I got back home late that night, feeling very uneasy about staying in our house alone. I get in and I lock the doors to the house, double-checking everything. Being overly paranoid, I decided to sleep in the living room to keep an eye on things. That's when our kitchen telephone started ringing again. I decided to get up and answer it, thinking it may be my mom checking up or maybe a friend. I answered, only to hear,
"I'm going to kill you."
And then they hung up. This was before cell phones, so I panicked and tried calling the hotel in Portland that my mom was staying at. There was no answer. Then I decided to call the police. Right as I began speaking to the operator, there was a loud banging on our front door. I'm telling this to the operator, curling up into a ball in the corner of our kitchen, trying to hide. That's when I hear a loud knock on our back door, the door to our kitchen. I go into complete panic mode and reach for a large kitchen knife. I tell the operator someone needs to arrive immediately, hearing knocks now coming from both the front and back doors at the same time. I decided that I'm going to kick the front door open as hard as I can and run down the street to my best friend's house. I gather my courage, rip open the door, and it's pitch dark out. But I see a figure on my right-hand side. Without thinking or looking, I blindly stabbed out and ran out the door in a complete frenzy. I never ran so fast in my life, and couldn't believe that I had actually stabbed someone. I got to my friend's house and banged on the door. His mom and dad come down and are shocked at what I tell them. I ask where my friend is, and they were confused, saying earlier that night he was going to be hanging out with me. A couple of minutes go by and my friend walks in, with a gash below his collarbone, looking white as a ghost. He got fucked up at the party and blacked out and thought it would be funny if he and another guy pranked me. His parents were beyond pissed off and had to deal with the police thinking he was attempting to kill someone when they showed up. It's safe to say we are no longer best friends, and now I have a perpetual phobia of any late-night phone calls. A detour in Dudleytown. I grew up mostly in western Connecticut, and though my family moved around a lot in my teens, I attended summer camp every year in Cornwall, Connecticut. In total, I attended or worked at the camp for 8 summers. When I was 15 or 16, I was a CIT, a counselor in training. I had a strange experience with some of the other girls while hiking outside at night. Hiking outside at night? What made you think that was a good idea, you might ask? But rest assured, we had a good reason. One class held every week culminated in an overnight camping trip, and one of our friends was supervising it. We decided that since she was going to be sitting out alone in the middle of the woods, making sure all the girls actually went to bed, she might benefit from some company. So about 5 or 6 of us headed out with flashlights to find the campsite. To clarify, this camp is by no means large. It sits on one side of a commercial ski mountain on a large lake. And the campsite our friend was at was alongside a wooded path at the far side of the camp's boundaries. A lovely walk during the day, but a couple of my friends were really timid and nervous about walking around it at night, even though we had attended the camp for years. Don't get me wrong, it wasn't a frightening place, other than the darkness and raccoons. Well, we started out on our walk around 9:30 and followed the wooded path out to a wide gravel road. This road led to a boat launch site, and we remembered that our friend had told us to not go towards the lake, and the site wasn't far from that turnoff. None of us had ever actually been to the site itself, and were a little on edge as we started walking away from the water, up the wide, gravel-covered road. There were lots of animal noises around, and hey, it was night, so it was dark. There really was no reason for any of us to actually feel afraid, because the wildlife was more or less accustomed to people and stayed scarce when people were around. Also, we were on a road, not lost in the middle of the woods. We kept walking, but didn't see any sign of a campsite. After a while, someone suggested that we turn back, and another person suggested that we walk just a little further. I remember feeling inclined to keep walking, because the campsite had to be just a little farther up the road. We had started walking uphill, and someone finally gave an ultimatum, saying we'd been out for more than an hour, and she was scared to walk any further. I was skeptical, even though I too had begun to feel somewhat uneasy. We turned around. I had an odd feeling through the whole walk back that I shouldn't turn around and see what was behind us, which probably spooked me more than anything else. I just felt like there was something that was there pushing us away. We nearly missed our turn back to camp, and when we made it back to the camp center, we found the camp director and several maintenance workers looking panic-stricken. They told us it was past midnight, and our friend who had been out on the overnight had brought her campers back an hour earlier when she found out there was going to be a powerful thunderstorm running through. She hadn't known where we were. She knew we had planned to come visit her and went straight to the director so we could be found because she hadn't seen us on the path at all. We explained what had happened, how we couldn't find the campsite, how we had kept walking and had no idea that we'd been out for as long as we had. Our friend looked confused. She said this wasn't possible. She explained that we couldn't possibly have missed her campsite. It was right off the little wooded path that we had first walked down, and they had built up a large fire that was easily visible from the path. We shrugged it off as just a strange experience, but over the years, the explanation that we just missed seeing them and walked up a gravel road for a couple of miles never really sat quite right with me. I didn't learn the strangest part of the story until a couple of years ago. There is a small town located within an uninhabited portion of Cornwall and Cornwall Bridge, Connecticut, called Dudleytown or Dudleyville, depending on who you talk to. The ghost town, so to speak, is called one of the most haunted places in the country, with a long history of inhabitant mental illness, disappearances, murder, ghost sightings, you name it. Some of the most poignant stories of the strange going-ons in Dudleytown have been recently documented. Spirit sightings, orbs, mechanical failure, cold spots, and the most startling discovery for me was the knowledge that Dudleytown was located just a few miles from our camp, and according to my map readings, along the road we had walked down that night. There's not much there to see, just a few old ruins that are overgrown with growth, and the property owners really don't want anybody walking around or investigating anything there. Had some unseen forces been playing with us that night? Were they trying to push us out or make sure that we didn't wander into Dudleytown? I have no other explanation. All I know is we walked through Dudleytown and never seemed to get out of it until we turned around. Haunted. I've experienced hauntings my whole life. I've moved often, and most of the houses had some sort of strange phenomenon happening. I've had ghosts that like to laugh in the middle of the night, play with knives and silverware, walk up and down halls, sing, watch you in your sleep, give you nightmares, play with the edge of your vision, that sort of stuff. For those of you faint of heart, don't worry. I'm not here to tell you that you will die because of your haunt, but I'm here to tell you that they feed off of your fear, and that the only way they can hurt you is if you allow them to. So this is my story. It was of a house I no longer live in, but is one of the most memorable. At the time, I wasn't too happy. Actually, I was depressed, and it only made it worse that the only thing I could look forward to was to write letters to my friends who lived in my old town. It wasn't much fun at the time. The only sense of thrill that I had was when I went into my parents' room alone. They'd ask me to get something for them or to do something, and I'd always dread it. I hated the feeling that room gave me. It just seemed to radiate an evil so badly that you could feel it from the stairs. Every time I'd go in, I'd feel eyes on me, and it filled me with the worst feeling of anything I'd ever felt before. It was angry, furious, and it wanted to kill me. I knew it did. I could almost hear the sinister thoughts as it watched from the corners of the room, glaring and waiting for its chance. I knew if it got the chance, it would kill me. Yet the knowledge I knew even then was that the spirits had no power over you unless you gave them that power. My aunt, uncle, and cousin came to visit, and my cousin was 5 at the time. My aunt and uncle had just married, and his daughter became hers as well. They were staying with us before they could move into their new house, and it would be a month before they would leave. My cousin started to speak to an imaginary friend around the time she came to our house. She'd address her friend as Lala, and we'd often find her pleading and yelling at this imaginary friend, saying, "Stop it, Lala! Don't do that!" It went on for a while, but her parents finally told her to stop talking to Lala. But she didn't. One night changed everything. My dad was walking upstairs to go to bed, and I heard this story later from him. He turned to see a little girl standing in the hall. Thinking it was my cousin, he told her that she should be in bed, but she ran past him and into his room. He followed her in there, pretty pissed that she'd disobey like that. Going into his room, he saw her slip into his closet. But when he turned the light on, no one was in there. Thinking she had slipped out when he wasn't looking, he went to her room to check. She was fast asleep, and had been the entire time. Later that night, my mom and dad were in bed when my mom said something grabbed her feet. My dad told her to just go back to sleep, and it was nothing. But it happened again, and she started freaking out this time. She told my dad to get whatever it was out of her house. He yelled at it to get out of the room, and it did. But it simply stayed outside the door, tapping it softly from time to time, and even jiggling the handle. And once or twice he could swear he heard a little girl giggle. He yelled for it to get out of the house, and once again it obeyed. We never had anything funny happen there again. But the strange thing did happen the next day. My cousin never saw Lala ever again. She had stopped talking to herself and never had another imaginary friend. I think what bothers me most is that I had such a feeling of dread and terror in my parents' room. But it came to my father and mother as a little girl. Was it disguising itself? I don't know. Weird house, that's for sure. An Unexplained Fire. I used to live in a pre-Civil War house, and one night I was in the midst of a dream, and I was dreaming my dog was pulling at my clothes and pinching my skin with her teeth. I awoke to this being a reality. My dog was trying to wake me up, and she was covered in a gray ash. I mean, she was literally gray instead of her natural yellow cover. My room was full of floating gray olive-green smoke, and my walls were covered in soot. My lungs were full of smoke and residue, and I was coughing up black tar, and my tongue was sticking to the roof of my mouth. One more second of sleep, I think I would have been dead. I rushed my dog and myself out of the bedroom and collapsed on the floor coughing. When I was done coughing out a tar-like resin and could somewhat breathe again, I looked back into my room to see the smoke still hovering. From the floor halfway up to the ceiling, it was clear. From there up to the ceiling, it was just a thick, still smoke. After opening up the windows, I noticed on the little plastic table alongside my bed, there was a pile of ashes. This whole thing was very strange, considering the night before. I had wanted a cigarette, but had no lighter or matches on me. I was too lazy and didn't feel like walking downstairs, so I just decided to put the smoke off till the next day. Like I said, there were no matches or lighters in my room. I know for a fact because I looked very hard before giving up, going to sleep. I went and touched the first pile of ashes, and it fell apart simply from the touch of my finger. It was my wallet. The strange thing is, all of the plastic cards, like credit cards, my license, and that sort of thing, they were all cooked along the edges, like they were baked. The only untouched part of the cards were dime-sized circles in the center of them. I also noticed my wallet was not the only thing that was a disintegrated pile of ashes. The PlayStation CDs and my cell phone on the table were also toast. I thought maybe the battery of my cell phone exploded, but the burn on the tabletop was distributed evenly. The burns, or should I say baked-in marks on the table, were only under the burnt items. The rest of the surrounding tabletop was untouched and in perfect condition. If it were a normal fire, there would have been warping and disfigurement of this thin, cheap plastic table. I also noticed a glass candle holder with no candle in it that was literally melted into the table. I mean, the glass was actually melted down. I had oily black soot on my legs and above my head on the wall, too. This was weird because the soot on me was different than the soot on my dog and the walls. It was really oily, like shoe polish. Picture the McDonald's logo. Now vertically cut that M in half. This was the shape of very dark soot over my head on the wall, like it came out of me or something. The rest of the walls were light gray ash, like the ash covering my life-saving dog. I actually had a sunburn on the side of my arm and face from the hot fire that had occurred. To this day, I still wonder how the soot got under my covers on my body. Why was it oily, and why the soot over my head on the wall was darker than the rest of the walls? The fire department came to my house and could not find a source of fire. None at all. They were all quite baffled. One of the firemen told me to buy my dog a bone because she saved my life, and that the fire was more of a flash of heat at least 1,200 degrees in order to melt the glass candle holder on my table. He said he hates to use the words, but it's considered a spontaneous combustion. But of what? It did remind me of a photo I once saw that had a body that had spontaneously combusted. The body was cooked, but not all the body was burned. The bed was only burned under the body, like my tabletop in my room. It was only burned under the cooked items. I put the table outside because, 1, it creeped me out, and 2, I got tired of the volunteer firemen who came along with the paid firemen who kept calling me and kept wanting to see the table where the fire first took place. Looking back, before the fire, my roommate and I saw a green orb floating over the cornfield across the street from my old home. Could the two things have been related? Who knows, but I'm lucky to be alive. And I love my dog. Missing time. I'm not exactly sure what happened on the night I'm about to tell you about, but here's what I remember. I was 15 years old, and I wanted to sneak out to see my girlfriend over at her house after everyone fell asleep. So I told my parents I was staying the night at a friend's house, and I did indeed go to their house for a little while. Around midnight, I left my friend's house and started to ride my bike towards where my girlfriend lived. It was usually about a half-hour ride. And shortly after I began my journey, I saw a man walking down the road that kind of gave me the creeps. As I rode past him, he asked me which way it was to the highway. I told him that he was headed in the wrong direction, and that it was about 5 miles the other way. He made some noises that implied he was unhappy, and I just continued to ride my bike. To get to my girlfriend's house, I had to take a route that was partially on paved road, and then it became a dirt road that went through some woods. About 2 miles after I saw the man, I came to a part of the trail that required going through a broken fence and then crossing an interstate. On the other side of the road was another trail that led to another paved road. When I reached that pavement, I saw a man walking in my direction. Mind you, this road dead ends into this trail, and there aren't any homes for about 100 yards or so. And this guy also gave me the creeps. But what really creeped me out was that when I got closer, I saw that he looked just like the first guy, and again asked me which way it was to the highway. Even if the man knew where I was heading and had a car, there is no way in hell that he could have possibly beat me out to the point where I was at this time. He walked off, and I pedaled to my girlfriend's house. When I got there, I knocked on her window, but she didn't answer. I tried a few more times, but no response. I checked the time on my watch and realized it was almost 5 in the morning. I had left right after midnight. I had ridden the same route dozens of times before, and it never took me more than a half hour. But here I was, 5 hours later with no recollection of anything else happening except what I just told you about those two men. I have no idea who those guys were, and I have no idea what happened to that time. It's never happened again, but that night still bothers me to this day. The Shadowman. When I was little, anywhere from 2 to 4 years old, my older sister and I used to sleep in the same bed. There was a closet at the end of the bed, and on some nights I would see a shadow man come out of the closet. He wore a trench coat and a fedora-style hat. I remember him vividly. He wasn't wispy. He was like solid shadow, just dark. Whenever I saw him, I would be paralyzed and couldn't move. My sister would always be dead asleep next to me and never woke up when I saw him. He would walk right up to the side of my bed and take what looked like a knife out of its coat and hold it above me like he was going to stab down on me. Then I wouldn't remember anything past that point. This happened several times, and I know it was no dream. I was fully awake. I never doubted what I was seeing was real. I would tell my parents what I saw, and they would just tell me I was having nightmares. And I remember feeling so hurt that they didn't believe me. And I also felt betrayed because they would not help me or protect me from this thing. Last summer, I got up the nerve to ask my sister if she ever saw anything unusual in our bedroom at night when we were kids. She said that sometimes she would see a white lion made out of what she called white shadow. It would sit at the foot of the bed and just stare at her. And she too was paralyzed. She said she was afraid it would open its mouth and roar, and she felt if it did, she would die. She would just stare at it until it wasn't there anymore. I recently did some research online and found out something about rare white lions in Africa, They're the only white lions on Earth, and there's a lot of interesting folklore behind them. The lions are meant to be the representation of their gods, and were actually given to us from those gods as gifts. They descended from the sky to a specific location in Africa a long time ago. Interesting. Well, later that summer, I asked my mom if she remembered me complaining about the Shadowman from the closet when I was young. She said she did remember, and I expressed how hurt I was that she had brushed it off and didn't seem to help me. And then she told me something she had never told me before in all my years. She said she just thought it was my imagination because she used to imagine the same thing too. In her bedroom where she slept when she was little, there was a closet at the foot of her bed too, and I remember this when In the bedroom where she slept when she was little, there was a closet at the foot of her bed too, and I remember this room at my grandparents' house. She said when she was little she used to think there was a man in a coat and a hat who would come out of the closet and hold a knife over her like he was going to stab her. She would hide terrified under the covers until it went away. I'm not going to lie. I felt even more hurt that my mother had blown me off, and she had experienced the exact same thing as a child. She did know what I was going through, but refused to acknowledge it or help me. My mother had never told me this before. We had the same experience of the same-looking shadow man doing the same things to us. I forgave her. I wasn't really going to hold a grudge, but we talk about it now and still can't figure out its significance, if there is any. The Guy Who Pretended to Be My Father by Bob 4786. So when I was in probably the second or third grade, we had an early dismissal day. For those of you who don't know, that's when school goes for longer than half a day, but we get out an hour or so early. I remember sitting silently in class working on math problems when the phone rang. I joked to my friend next to me that I hoped it was for me. We all watched the teacher answer the phone because we knew that 90% of the time it meant someone was going to be leaving class. When the teacher's eyes met with mine, I suddenly got worried. I was an anxious kid, so I immediately thought that someone in my family had died. My teacher said something into the phone and then asked me, "Bob, when are you getting off the bus today?" I thought this was really weird. My mom knew when I would be getting home because she always had to leave work early so she could be home when I got home. I just told the teacher the normal time. The teacher talked for a few more seconds and then hung up the phone. I asked her what it was about, and she told me that my parent just wanted to double-check what time I got off the bus. I really didn't think about it too much for the rest of the day. And later, I got off the bus and walked home without incident. When I walked in the front door, my mom asked me about my day and took my coat. I remember the look on her face when I asked her, "Why did you call the school to see what time I was getting off the bus?" She looked shocked. She said that she hadn't called the school. I told her the whole story. She immediately started making frantic phone calls. I knew something was wrong, but I watched some TV while my mom talked. About 20 minutes later, my stepdad came home early from work. And about 10 minutes after that, a state trooper pulled up. I was pretty scared because I thought somehow I was in trouble. The state trooper asked me a few questions like, "Has anyone tried to talk to you while you've walked home from the bus stop? Have you seen anyone parked at the bus stop who didn't have a kid get into their car? Has anyone tried giving you a ride?" The answer to all his questions was no. I had never seen anyone suspicious as we lived in a pretty decent neighborhood, and it was mostly old retired folk who lived around us. My mom asked me to go upstairs and pack my bag, as it was my dad's weekend for visitation. When my dad got there to pick me up, he was questioned pretty heavily by the state trooper. I was eavesdropping from upstairs. My mom called me back down, and I left with my dad for the weekend. My dad ended up teaching me some basic self-defense, which I thought was pretty cool. I never heard anything about the situation, and eventually I forgot about it. Later, my mom told me that someone had called my school posing as my dad. This man knew my dad's full name, my full name, and my mom's full name. He kept saying that my mother wanted him to pick me up from the bus stop because she wasn't going to be able to leave work early that day. The school didn't even bother calling my mother. I believe the only thing that saved me from being abducted was the fact that I had told the man that I'd be getting off the bus at the normal time, which is around 3:15, but due to the early dismissal, I had actually gotten off the bus at around 1:45. I realized that this guy had probably either been a family member or a family friend. And this scares me even more because our family lives in the same house, has the same family members, the same family friends. After talking to my mom again, she told me that she was pretty sure that it was an abusive ex-boyfriend. I guess the guy straight out told her that he was going to kidnap me after they broke up. So, creepy guy who wanted to abduct me, let's not meet. I'm a lot bigger now, and I don't think you'll have an easy time trying to abduct me. The Lindsay Indians. My name is Dawn, and I'm writing about some experiences that happened over a 26-year period in Lindsay, Ontario, Canada. I lived in a duplex there from 1979 to July of 2004. When we moved in, I felt that there was something not quite right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I would often see shadows out of the corners of my eyes, but some experiences my friends had had over the years had convinced me that something was going on. It got so that kids to this day on our street talk about the haunted house at the bottom of the street just across from the park. To be honest, I don't know if the lady who moved in 2004 has experienced anything or not. We got settled in, and my friend Sandra came over and stayed the night. She told me the next morning she was watching TV, and in the corner of the living room she saw something she described as an Indian, maybe 16 years old in a white buckskin outfit, and she was very pretty. The thing seemed to be trying to communicate with Sandra, but couldn't quite get through, yet she felt that she was trying to let her know she meant her no harm. Another friend, also named Sandra, came over with her husband Albert, and they both witnessed my cable box turn the TV on, and the channels start to change on their own. This was in the 80s, and if you're old enough to remember, you know that those cable boxes were huge, and they had the wires attached to the TV. It had a lever that you pushed up or down to get the station, so, not knowing what else to do, I took it back to the cable company and told them it kept changing stations on me and I wanted a new one. You can imagine their reaction when I told them what was going on. Albert told me that I was living in what was known as the French Indian Village. He would know about it as he was an Indian from Curve Lake and lived in Lindsay for a long time. Albert also felt something was there. He described where the Indian Village was, that it ran along the Schuylkill River and just past the Weldon High School, and from King Street to Hillside Drive. I suppose you can look all that up online. In the 80s, a girl by the name of Pam babysat for me on Wednesdays when I went to meetings at our church. And one day I came home to a note that said she took the kids to her place to sit as she was scared. I went over and she told me she heard heavy footsteps coming up my basement stairs, and then the basement door seemed to breathe in and out. That's how she described it. Well, she was petrified with fear of what was happening and got the kids out of the house. My next-door neighbor told me she felt someone touching her toes while she was sleeping in her room often. And her sister had had a dream of an Indian girl about 16, and you guessed it, in a white buckskin dress coming through the wall between my bathroom and the second bathroom upstairs. Her sister knew nothing about what had been going on at my home, yet described the girl exactly as my friend Sandra had. My friend Margaret, her son Bert, and daughter Ellen were visiting me one time in the spring of 82 or 3, I can't remember. I had my little parakeet in his cage on its tripod, and Margaret was enjoying his chirps when the tripod suddenly lifted up in front of us and gently lit on the floor. My cat Pinky looked through the stairway banister and meowed. I think she was trying to tell me she didn't do it. My husband had strange things happen to him while in the basement. A lot of his stuff would disappear, and often he would get poked in the waist while sitting at his workbench in the far corner. Also, once in a while he was pushed on the stairs going up to the second floor. He thought he was just clumsy or something, but my neighbor's son, who was about 9 or so at the time, had the same experience of being pushed down the stairs, and Margaret was pushed into the hallway on the main floor more than once. My husband also saw people that weren't there. Once I came in from outside, and he asked me where the heavy lady who was walking beside me up the driveway was, and I didn't know who or what the hell he was talking about. He also saw a shadowy child coming and going up the stairs a lot. In the early 90s, my neighbor and friend moved out, and a lady by the name of Penny moved in, and a few days later she came over and said, I may think she was crazy, but she kept seeing Indian ghosts around the house, and some of them were creepy looking. They had slit throats. She felt it very scary and didn't think I would believe her, but was surprised when I told her I did and shared my experiences and the experiences of my friends and family. At this point, I had made it a point not to tell anyone that I had just met of what was going on unless they asked. When Penny moved out, Rob and Jen moved in, and one day in 1998, as Jen and the children were at my place helping me sort out some toys, Rob came home and went into their place. A few minutes later, he came over with a very strange look on his face. He said that when he went inside, he saw Jen sitting on the sofa. And then when he actually went into the room, no one was there, but the TV was on, and a show about Indian life was playing. Later, he heard drums and smelled smoke, and being curious, looked out the window and saw a log home and what seemed to be an Indian campsite. He was baffled when he went outside to investigate, and it was just a normal backyard. His son Chris came up from Oshawa in March of 2001, and he had a new digital camera. He took some pics on the Rainbow Bridge and of his sister in her room, and when they were downloaded onto his computer, he was shocked. One picture he took on the bridge had an illusion of a wolf head. He figured it was his breath, but the other picture showed his sister's face eaten away and orbs floating around the two girls. That was really terrifying. My friends new and old have talked about their experiences with one another when they were introduced to each other, and found that they were somewhat similar. Strange stuff indeed. I wonder if things are still happening there. It wasn't terribly scary, to be honest, but it was kind of unsettling to live there. Maybe sometime I will go back and ask the owners if anything has happened. Very interesting time of my life. Hey gang, Uncle Josh here. Thanks for listening. I appreciate your listenership. If you would do me a favor, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel if you haven't already done so. And follow me on social media. Links to my Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter accounts can be found in the description of this video. Also, please consider becoming a patron of this channel for exclusive content and more. If you would like your story featured here, send it to me at unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. Make sure you give your story a title, or I can do that, but be sure to change any names to protect the innocent. And now I sound like Jack Webb. Anyway, if you have sent a story in and haven't heard it yet, you will. I try to stay ahead of the game and have volumes already published, so it might be a couple volumes before you hear your story. Thanks again, and until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.